39 Amersham Road here in Harold Hill in Romford in Essex seems like a fairly innocuous place on a fairly average British street. But of course that was exactly why it was chosen in August 1980 to play such a massively important role in the history of British social housing. For it was here, amongst the hubbub of press and publicity, that the relatively newly appointed Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher handed over the title deeds of the house to a young James and Maureen Paterson, and with it relaunched what was to become her flagship policy, not just an incentive towards home ownership, but an actual right to buy.
In the 1980s, under Margaret Thatcher, the right to buy was introduced, and that meant that tenants of council housing could buy their council home, but this was at a massive discount. So you didn't pay the price that it would be valued at on the market. You got a huge subsidy to buy your home.
Mrs Thatcher's appearance in Harold Hill marked London's 12,000th council house sale, and this was seen as a real tipping point at which the policy began to gain traction. The couple who lived there had lived in the property for 18 years and so qualified for a 40% discount. And after putting down a deposit of just £5, they managed to buy the house outright for £8,315. But perhaps the most telling thing was what the Prime Minister chose to say to them when she was given a tour of their new property. "This is not just a house," she reportedly said. "It's now a home." The Conservative manifesto also promised we shall offer 100% mortgages for these properties. This policy was a huge vote winner amongst traditional Labour voters. Despite being vehemently opposed to the Act in 1980, by the time the general election came round in 1987, the Labour Party had to drop its opposition to Right to Buy. Home ownership had grown from 55% of the population in 1980 to 67% by the time Thatcher left office in 1990. She christened this the creation of a property-owning democracy. And for working families who otherwise would never dream of home ownership, it was, to say the very least, an incredibly tempting offer, both financially and politically.
The Right to Buy was a success for some people. Yes, what it did was it expanded hugely working class home ownership. So in that sense, it fulfilled the long-term Conservative goal of helping to create a property-owning democracy. However, what subsequently happened is that many of those right-to-buy homes have been sold off into hands of private landlords. So what it's actually done is it's created what I call a private landlord owning plutocracy. What's happened is that property transfers have been moved away from home ownership into private landlord hands. So something like over 40% then of all the homes which have been sold under the right to buy are now owned by private landlords. So what it's done is it's helped to create a landlord class, a new landlord class. So it's expanded the numbers of private tenants on estates.
Over 1 million properties have left the social housing world and now are being bought and sold by private landlords in the private sector, and those 1 million properties have not been replaced. So that's 1 million homes that would have been available to people on low incomes or no incomes that is no longer available.
As local councils sold off 1.5 million new homes, £28 billion went back to the central government treasury. However, at the same time, they stopped building homes at such impressive speeds. Previously, the state had been the biggest builder of new homes each year, but as the funding dried up, these numbers fell off a cliff edge, and new council housing numbers fell below that of the private sector and then below that of even housing associations. Now, to put this in perspective, in just 35 years between 1946 and 1981, Britain built 5 million new council homes. But in the 40 years since then, we've only built 250,000. Those who were not offered the opportunity to buy their homes, however, were the tenants of charitable housing associations. Now, the reason for this was, in the case of organisations like Guinness and Rowntree and Peabody, their homes simply weren't the state's assets to give away. However, a right to buy for housing associations has been floated several times and even trialled in recent years.
I'm sitting on the fence with regards to whether right to buy for housing associations is a good idea. Now, I think it's a great idea if there were the means in place to replace each property. If we sell off the properties and we don't replace them, then we're diminishing the stock. We will end up where we are now and even worse further down the line.
Beyond the impact of Right to Buy, the 1980s and early 1990s also brought with them other policy changes that impacted the housing landscape considerably. Chief amongst these was something called stock transfer, which shifted the momentum from local councils to housing associations.
The government introduced something called stock transfer, which was where a council could go through a ballot process with residents to see if they wanted their homes, the management of their homes, to pass on to an independent housing association, and that was called stock transfer. So many of the housing associations in this country own and manage homes that were originally council-run homes.
It was really a way then of sort of taking power away from local authorities in terms of social housing provisions and then transferring it to housing associations. So what it's contributed towards is the way then that the council housing sector has shrunk and the housing association sector has expanded.
But we share the same objectives. It's around providing good quality, affordable homes to people on lower incomes, but also making sure that as a social landlord, we're there for the long term, working with our communities.
Very sadly, things didn't actually work out too well for the Pattersons in the end. Their marriage broke down sometime later, and reportedly this was partially because of the cost of rising interest rates and the mortgage on their new property here. Mrs. Patterson ended up having to be forced to sell the home. Now, according to public records, she managed to get £55,995 for it in 1996, but she also told the Daily Telegraph soon after that by the time she'd paid off the remaining mortgage, she only had enough left to buy a mobile home. So in many ways she'd actually stepped down the property ladder rather than up it. But at the same time, you simply can't deny that the Right to Buy policy was hugely important for many, many people and had some not wholly ignoble outcomes. A sense of pride, improved appearance, a real sense of place, and a willingness to invest in a property. But above all else, the ability of working class families to build wealth and build an asset base, often for the very first time in the history of their family. Now, this house last sold in 2016 for £290,000. That means it's gone up 35 times in value in just 36 years since the Pattersons first bought it. And that's absolutely great for the approximately 2 million families who benefited from Right to Buy. But if you're a young family like Mr. and Mrs. Patterson trying to start out on this street now, then you'd find not only 7,000 households ahead of you on the waiting list, but you'd also find that many of these houses which have been bought under Right to Buy were being let out by private landlords at a wholly unaffordable £1,600 a month. The problem, many now agree, is that we simply need to build more homes.